It was a case that spanned 5 European countries. When 47-year-old truck driver Volker Eckert was apprehended on the 17th of November 2006, the police had no idea of the extent of his history of murder. Eckert had been on the run for 2 weeks after killing a Bulgarian prostitute in the north of Spain. When detectives searched the cab of his articulated lorry, they found photographs and hair clippings from 5 women whom he'd abducted and murdered across Europe. Eckert's defense lawyer was Alexander Schmidtgall.
He confessed immediately after he got arrested by the police. You have this quite often when you have serial killers, or when you have people who have a burden carried with them for a long time. It was like a relief for him to speak with someone and to tell what he did. Yeah? So it was like a confession in a church for him.
Schmidtgall couldn't believe the person he was talking to was the same cold-blooded killer he'd read about in the police files.
So you think there's a monster in front of you, but the actual communication with him, he was a very normal guy. He was like someone selling you life insurance. He was nothing special.
Prosecutors wanted to find out what was going on inside the head of Volker Eckert. He was sent off to be assessed by forensic psychologist Professor Norbert Nedopil.
He came from prison, guided by 2 policemen, into my offices, and then he sat with me for several hours alone, without policemen and without any handcuffs. And we had a long and serious conversation, sometimes sad, sometimes for him or frightening events, sometimes also were very nice and personal, and even sometimes we laughed together.
Eckert, who lived in the small town of Horf in Germany, had murdered his final victim on November the 2nd, 2006. Local journalist Rainer Meyer remembers the story well.
Volker Eckert hat seine letzte Tat.
Volker Eckert's last victim was the prostitute Milena Petrova near Ostelrich in Catalonia, North Spain.
Spanien, Katalonien. Dort hat die.
He picked her up there and abused her in his lorry. He spent another day driving around.
Tag lang herumgefahren in der Fahrerkabine. Und am nächsten Morgen.
And the morning after, he dumped her at a nearby stone bridge.
Steinbruch in der Nähe entsorgt.
On the way back from the stone bridge, he was caught on CCTV.
Einer Überwachungskamera.
Somebody was erecting CCTV cameras, which hadn't been there before, and just to test them, panned. One of the images it caught was Eckert's lorry. And when the body that he dumped nearby was found, almost the first place the police went was to look at this entirely accidentally caught CCTV imagery, which led them directly to Eckert.
Eckert's job took him all over the continent. A Europe-wide search was conducted, and on November the 17th, 2006, detectives found him and his truck at a car wash in Cologne.
When they searched the lorry, they found evidence that this was not a one-off act. There were Polaroid photographs of other victims. There were trophies in the lorry. It was perfectly obvious that this was Eckert's lair. Almost every serial killer in one form or another has what's come to be known as a lair. And in his case, it wasn't so much a flat or a cottage or a house. It was the cab of his lorry.
After his arrest, Eckert immediately confessed to a murderous career that had lasted for over 30 years. It was the beginning of a huge international story.
Es waren 5 Morde, 3 in Spanien.
There were 5 murders, 3 in Spain, 2 in France. And from then on, it was a really hot story. As a journalist, you don't have a serial killer very often. And at that point, I tried to get as much information as I could about this person.
Wie möglich über diesen Menschen herauszubekommen.
His story begins over 50 years ago. Volker Eckert was born in the small East German town of Plauen on July the 1st, 1959. From a very young age, he developed a fascination with women's hair.
When he was 9 years old, he started to be fond of the doll of his sister, a doll which had long hair, and he put them in front of him on his bed. He was feeling sexual arousal, plunging his hands into the hair of this doll.
We describe him as a trichophiliac. This is somebody who gains sexual pleasure from hair, essentially. And I think he would have been aware of the fact that this was something odd, this was something out of the ordinary. And I think that would have created a bit of a sense of shame within him. So he was aware that this was something that he had to keep hidden.
As Eckert entered adolescence, his parents' marriage began to break down.
Well, he had quite a turbulent time during his teenage years. His parents divorced and he reacted really badly to this.
The separation for him was influential because the father had to leave the house, and he said, I swore to myself, that will never happen to me, and I will not marry because I don't want to work all the time and then be thrown out of the house. And he took sides with his father after that. But he continued to live with his mother.
He went off the rails, and one incident involved taking his parents' car and going off on a bit of a joyride. And then he returned home, and he was in a lot of trouble for that. And it wasn't too long after that incident that he actually went and physically attacked and killed one of his classmates.
In 1974, aged just 14, Eckert experienced taking a life for the very first time. But it wasn't until his arrest in November 2006, over 3 decades later, that anyone knew about it.
Volker Eckert hat ja gestanden, dass eine
Volker Eckert confessed to killing a classmate and to disguising her murder as a suicide. And that crime was not solved for years, or for almost 32 years.
30 Jahre lang nicht geklärt worden.
On May the 7th, 1974, Eckert had knocked on the door of his 14-year-old school friend and neighbour, Sylvia Unterdörfel. Realising her parents weren't home, he took the opportunity of living out the fantasy he'd dreamed of since playing with his sister's doll as a child.
And then he thought, well, I have to do it with a real girl. And he, of course, like many fetishists, they realize they won't do it voluntarily with me. So I have to force them.
She was somebody who had very long, very beautiful hair, and he developed a real fixation, a real obsession with her hair. And he went to where she lived, her home, and basically wormed his way in.
Und dieses Mädchen
First, this girl only played a role in his fantasy as a victim. But the point came when this fantasy wasn't enough anymore. He wanted to do it. He wanted to stroke her and then kill her.
und dann auch töten.
He started right away after she let him in, closed the door, and he started getting at her throat and started to strangle her. And when she was unconscious, he plunged his hands into her hair.
Even as a teenager, Eckert had the sophistication to try and disguise the murder.
He strangled her with a clothesline, but he was quite cunning because he thought he needs to cover this up. So what he did is attach the end of the clothesline to a door handle to make it look as if she'd killed herself.
It is physically possible to hang yourself from a doorknob. You don't have to have your full body weight on the neck. And it's something that is occasionally seen, although it's uncommon.
Ihre Mutter, als sie dann von der Arbeit kam, hat die...
Just as her mother was getting home from work, she walked in to find her dead daughter. Of course, like with every unnatural death, the East German investigation authorities began their work and came to the conclusion that it was a suicide.
Es war ein Selbstmord.
Aber letzten Endes...
At the end, Eckert managed to set up the scene so cleverly that the police fell into his trap.
Und, ja.
And for 32 years, right up until Volker Eckert's confession, her parents had lived with the belief that their daughter had taken her own life.
Hat sich das Leben genommen.